Good afternoon, everyone from the virtual sphere. My name is Gwen Evans, and I'm the Vice President of Global Library Relations at Elsevier. I'm delighted to be joined by Carole Palmer, Professor and Associate Dean for Research at the University of Washington iSchool, as part of Elsevier's FlashSci Talks series. We feature prominent leaders from global academic and research institutions to share their views on topical issues affecting universities and libraries. Our information sector interviews within the FlashSci Talks series will center around the topics of the acceleration of changes that were already happening prior to the pandemic, including the provision of library services and the skills information professionals need going forward, the UN Sustainable Development Goals and their relationship to the traditional missions of libraries and other information organizations globally, and information management programs and education, and the urgency to address issues like information literacy and the credibility of research. Today, Professor Palmer and I will be discussing the dynamic role of schools of information management, or iSchools, during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. I'm looking forward to hearing more from her perspective as a library leader and expert in information management. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the floor for Professor Palmer to introduce herself and dive into her questions for today's interview. Professor Palmer.
Thank you, Gwen. It's really very nice to be here and to be able to engage in these questions. I've been here at the Information School at the University of Washington for about 6 years, and before that was at the University of Illinois. And so I've been an iSchool, leader for some time, I guess, both as an associate dean and before that running a research center. And so I'm always eager to, talk about the role of information schools and where they're headed. So I don't know, are you going to pose questions?
Yes, I will pose each question. So question one is, in a post-COVID world, what role should the schools of information management play in shaping science and research in society?
So that's a great question, Gwen. I think the questions that have sort of been the focus of research and information science just have become more intensified. When we think about the moment of COVID and what it means for the research we do. So we now have these crises in public health and climate and economic and democratic stability. And I think, our core questions have often been how to mobilize information and data for science, for research, because, that is the, fundamental raw materials of research, or is that information and data. And then another core question has always been, how do we build information systems and those infrastructures, those larger infrastructures for access, but then more and more how to support collaboration. And so both, this idea of mobilizing a lot of resources and promoting and supporting collaboration, of course, have just become there's been a spotlight put on them, right? A spotlight that all about urgency and complexity, and also this idea of the need for trust and how much our old modes or some standing modes of, how we channel and interpret information, really can fail. And I guess particularly vivid display of that is the interplay we see between the pandemic and what some are calling the associated infodemic, right? The intertwining of that. So, I think as we see the conduct of research becoming much more rapid, and we certainly have seen it here, we have researchers who are writing proposals that are getting turned around very quickly. They're, moving very quickly into the analysis phases and turning out results because it's so of the now. It's things to do with the pandemic or things to do with the election where the results need to be turned around very quickly. So the more we get into this rapid research modalities, which is kind of an innovation in itself, we end up with more challenges around sort of what the validity and meaning and context is with, research that's turned around in that way. With the collaboration, that's also becoming much more global. So while we're putting up many barriers across countries of people not being able to move or travel or get together, convene, the other kinds of barriers are coming down in terms of communication and dissemination and sharing of resources. And then the other dynamic I actually wanted to mention was that with this escalation of activity and information and data, we have to take even more care as needed to support sort of the responsible and ethical practices in research. So having to combat bias, assure privacy, promote transparency, fairness, accountability, and inclusion. So these are sort of the changes I feel. And we're at this point now where it's there's a spotlight on all of it, having to be faster, more collaborative, and more responsible than ever, partly because of the rapid pace. But then that also, as an educator, that translates all. This is how we do our research. We're studying these really important questions about mobilizing data for, curing disease or advancing the economy or having a safe, fair election. How do we translate that into how we educate, our students? Because that's the other part of a school like ours. We're really dedicated to the research, but we've got a number of programs, and we want information leaders and innovators coming out of those programs. So, and it's never been a time where we've needed more innovation and leadership, I think. Access to information and data at every level is really vital. So everything from, the individual citizen to the most sophisticated research operations. And so we have programs and students who go into all those areas. So while I guess we can talk about this maybe a little later. So while my area of interest and much of what, much of our student body is related to the sort of the future of research, we also have a lot of information professionals who are going into the public sector, government, libraries, public libraries. And ultimately, I think there's going to be more and more collaboration across those sectors as well. And so we want to be, educating our students to be innovators, but also partners across sectors to solve these problems.
Thank you. So how do you see the role of the library within research organizations changing?
Yeah, I think one of the things I really feel about libraries is they no longer can do it all themselves. All the things they strive to do. So if we look at standard academic or research library, sort of the scale and scope of the expertise needed to build infrastructure and services for, say, data-driven science, or even the way field work, is conducted now with many new instruments and many kinds of data streaming together, supporting, there is no standard research, but supporting researchers, the complexity of research is becoming harder and harder, and much more technical and a lot more computational. And I think we just sort of need to really accept that and start to learn to build really innovative collaborations and partnerships. And so I think building infrastructure and services is going to be, it's kind of an old model for libraries, because we've always been involved in building consortium and building partnerships or regional partnerships. But I think we really need to do more and more of that. And so I think libraries can, be centers of excellence on their campuses for the areas that are of research strength that a campus has. But in doing so, they can partner with those departments, but also with research computing experts and information technology experts, the methodological experts in those fields on their campuses as well, to sort of optimize data resources that could be shared. One of the things I like to promote when I think about the future of research libraries is, I used to say radical sharing, radical sharing of data, sharing of code, sharing of everything. And now that we can't get out and collect new data, in some respects, that's becoming more valuable. But now I say radical and responsible sharing, because the other thing that we're needing to really step up to is we're one of the few fields where I think we're really sort of feel that responsibility for, we've always been the curators of knowledge for the long term. We feel like we have a real responsibility to do it ethically, responsibly, but also equally, right? We don't invest in one area of science, for instance, and all kinds of scholarship. So while, I'm really an advocate, I don't know how much you know about the work I've done, but really promoting and championing open data, both research data and civic data. But I really think that all needs to be qualified. So these open early stage research sharing possibilities that have actually been demonstrated with COVID in medical research very recently, right? This surge in preprint repository submissions. I mean, the numbers just skyrocketed in certain areas. Experiments with fast track peer review, that's also happening. These are the kinds of things that I think we need. Libraries can really help get behind, they can promote, they can be part of how that's done well, and how we keep some integrity around it. There's another surge that I don't think has happened, but seems like it probably should have with COVID. And that's, in the circles I run in, there's, in addition to research, data sharing, there's also a lot of talk about sharing negative results, which don't get out in the published literature. And I'm sure that in these, high-powered medical research areas, more and more, there's rapid negative results as well as rapid, advancement. And sharing those negative results are probably truly, truly valuable for those who are trying to sort out what to do next and what's already been done. So I think there's just a lot of challenges with this rapid research that libraries, researchers are going to start to be accustomed to this now. And I think there are some methods that are evolving that we'll need to be able to support, but also while we're doing that, really trying to make it rapid and rigorous research. So, we've always been intermediaries for promoting information access. And now we're very much also intermediaries for trying to promote data literacy. With the changes in more rapid and research, I also think libraries will probably have to go a little more all in on digital collections. I mean, people are more accustomed for being away. And so in doing so, those unique collections they have of data and primary materials are really great assets that they need to sort of develop and share, I think, and really exploit, contribute to the broader research arena. So that value of, aggregation, building rich contextual rich collections is sort of an old, it's an old tradition of libraries that I think can be renewed in this rapid age to really help with some of the things we could lose with this move towards more rapid exposure and sharing. So really taking the leadership on responsible sharing, that means sharing with provenance, making clear what the representativeness or bias might be within what's being shared, and setting up some standards and expectations around that as well.
What do you consider the critical skills for information professionals or librarians to master in the coming decade?
Well, there's a moving target there as well. Well, it's not moving, it's just growing, right? It's because I'm not willing to give up on, to me, there's no substitute for some of the very fundamental parts of information science, really knowledge organization and information use, information behavior. The field I do now is really translated into data practices, but it's the same idea. It's that centered towards the user orientation of what does the researcher really need to accomplish. So I think a lot of that, and then also, we've always in information schools been very focused on socio-technical systems. How do we understand our information systems and the social implications and impacts of use? So, we don't want to let go of any of that. The services we develop, the collections we build are all need to be driven by the communities we serve. And we sort of have a strong tradition and curriculum that already does that. But I really can't overemphasize or overstate the need for our students to be really getting a strong technical background as well. But that needs to be sort of deeply rooted in that broader ecosystem of information. So librarians that are going to support the research process, research libraries, for me, the fundamental knowledge is the research life cycle, right? It's in this day and age, that's often a very data-driven environment. So, when we have new curriculum around data curation and digital preservation, and now factoring in data science and visualization onto that, so that you not only understand the data resources and how to package and serve those as a service, for instance, you really understand a lot more about the analytical side and the applications, so that you are optimizing those for the best fit for use, or at least optimizing for them for broad use and also informed use, which means a lot of documentation, metadata, and provenance. So I think in addition to sort of I don't think we can overstate the technical. I want to actually jump back to the whole point about building partnerships. That isn't something that comes easily or naturally, because it really does take a lot of skill and also knowledge about how to build a strong collaboration, what are the different expertise that's needed. So, really educating students to be leaders who can build collaborations and teams within the library to solve problems. But really in universities, I think most of the problems facing us need to be partnerships with academic departments, the offices of research, research computing, supercomputing centers, other research institutes that are building new methods and novel methods. So it needs to be across the institution, but ultimately with open data and I think the increasing interest from and need in the public to also have access to data and scientific results, we need to figure out more about these cross-sector partnerships as well. Because while we're solving access problems, we can be doing it for the public as well as our researchers. I think that's a hard problem, how we be that inclusive, but there's a really interesting intersection between research and government data, for instance, that we may have local communities most interested in the government data, but there's a lot that can be leveraged across those two sectors. So I think that my two things would be, there's a lot of fundamental information science, but then the technical and that very important partnership building and understanding of the full cycle of information, whatever the domain you're in.
Thank you. Is there a particular sustainable development goal or area that information management or librarianship educators are or should be focused on?
Yeah, I like this question, but I don't have a very good answer, because I subscribe to the School of Information Science belief that we are a true meta science, that we really have responsibility for advancing knowledge across, all domains. And when you look at the sustainability goals, it's quite broad. It is focused, but it's broad. But it does also hit on all these existential crises we're in at the moment as well. So the crises in health and climate and democracy. So of course, I think all of those need to be prioritized. And so, yeah, and maybe a special commitment from libraries to the research needed to make progress on all those goals. So, locally, I think you would learn, or you would come to understand where you can make the greatest contributions to those goals in partnership, most likely with your scientists or your other departments on campus. and some of the social sciences. So, I think it's really that support for the research enterprises that you can have the most value in your institutions. But at the same time, I look at the goals, and I also think librarians in general are very well positioned, because when we look at something like the goal of peace, justice, and strong institutions, it's not something that lives in a particular domain or discipline. It is something that really cuts across, and that you need to have that very broad understanding of systems and interactions across different domains and disciplines. And so I think there is a special place for libraries when you think about strong institutions and justice, and the very principled approaches that we bring to information access being a really important part of that. But then learning to do those, there's also a goal that's partnership for goals. So of course, with my big push on partnership, moving towards positive change for any of these goals is really going to take that same kind of partnerships that I was talking about earlier.
And this is the last question.
Okay.
How does your research area fit in with interdisciplinary developments in information management and scholarly communication?
I feel like you made up this question just for me. So, I don't know actually how much you know about my background, but I really have from the very beginning, based on my experience as an academic librarian, really devoted my work to studying information in the interdisciplinary research process. So always interested in what makes information in research high impact. What are these kinds of strategic information practices that researchers can apply, that are going to, that we can support as information scientists and professionals. And so, but the focus of my work over the last 10 years or so has really been on trying to understand how we can promote reuse of data across disciplines. So thinking about data as one of those very, very critical assets, and that we know to solve the kinds of grand challenge problems we have, the complexity, the urgency of those problems, we have to mobilize a lot of data from a lot of different disciplines. So it's an age-old information science question in the sense that there, are how you to reduce the scatter of information and aggregate things and bring them together in a way that they can really solve a problem. But also making data, especially digital data, work across fields over the long term is a very hard problem and much more complex than I ever realized when I started going into it. So, we know we need to guard against a lot of potential loss, because digital data is so fragile and it's so fluid. And so, that loss of provenance, the loss of authenticity, the loss of intellectual history of where it's come from and what it's based on, all that context as it's moved, subsetted, reintegrated, repurposed. I think our job is to make sure we have as little loss as possible to sustain the value of those resources. So that's sort of my interest. And then so that, I think that fits into this idea of building up services and data services that are partnerships, because we always work directly in our work to study these things directly with the research communities themselves. Some of the communities I work with have been geobiology and earth system science, and some of them that relate a lot to those sustainability goals. But my new interest over the last few years has really been also how do we turn that to, again, finding ways to get things disseminated out to the public more, to journalists, to educators, to policymakers. How do we make sure they're benefiting from the research dissemination or the research resources that we're putting in our repositories, that we're protecting, that we're sharing? And so, most of my work had been promoting science, supporting science, their ability to interpret data and claims and produce results. But I now also am interested in how we, again, as librarians or as curators of data or information, how are we also paying attention to and possibly optimizing those resources so they can be turned to the popular press or social media, reach a broader audience. So those are the things that sort of I'm most interested in now as a researcher, but also I think fits, is an important part of sort of the future of how our profession is going to contribute to research, and also, how we can further support the research operations and enterprises in universities and government and elsewhere.
Well, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to share these valuable insights with us. And I'd like to once again amplify the role of information science schools in moving into this new post-COVID information sphere that libraries and librarians have always had a central role in. Again, thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to say as a final word on this interview?
No, I think just thank you for the opportunity. And I think, as we're in a very complex information environment, and we need to, there's urgency and complexity, and there's rapid, need for results, and there's rapid misinformation and dynamics that we need to understand and work to help control. So it's an exciting time, and there's a lot to contribute. So maybe this will inspire some people to join the field of information science.